Well, good evening and welcome to our webinar on the future of agriculture and farming. I'm Cristina Talaco, the Chair of Coalition Conservation, and I'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, paying my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. At C4C, we provide a platform for conservatives to debate ideas that address damage to our environment, reducing emissions while supporting the economy. To increase our ambitions, we believe that it's very important to connect conservative lawmakers from around the world to exchange reflections from their own jurisdictions. That's why we've been working closely to the UK Conservatives, as historically they've been successfully addressing climate change in line with conservative principles. So the purpose of tonight's event is to discuss initiatives that Australia and the UK are taking to promote sustainable agricultural practices and better land management, whilst mitigating climate and supporting farmers to secure economic welfare. The UK has shown an exceptional commitment to introducing sustainable farming, taking steps to minimize disruptions arising from Brexit to their farmers. And in Australia, we're one of the most efficient primary producers in the world, and we're trialing arrangements now to reward farmers for improving biodiversity together with carbon projects. So for our discussions tonight, we have an excellent panel of experts. It's my great pleasure to welcome them, starting with Jerome Mayhew, the member for Broadland for the UK Conservative Party, and a member of the Conservative Environment Network Parliamentary Caucus. Jerome sits on the Environmental Audit Select Committee. He's also the Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Environment Group. And from Australia, it's a privilege to have Darren Chester with us. Darren is the member for Gippsland for the National Party. He's our former Minister for Veterans Affairs, for Defence Personnel, and former Minister for Infrastructure and Transport, amongst other portfolios. And from industry, we have Doug McNichol, who manages sustainability and innovation for Meat and Livestock Australia, and Oscar Pierce, who's a sixth-generation beef farmer who has worked for a number of agricultural organizations in policy and management roles. Now, in terms of format, I'll first ask Jerome and Darren to share with us their insights. Then we'll go straight to the panel and start the discussions. So if you would like to ask questions from our panelists, please type them on the Q&A box on your screen. And after the Q&A, it will be my pleasure to invite our C4C ambassador and our former president of the Nationals, Larry Anthony, to do the final remarks. So let's get the ball rolling, and I'll start with Jerome. Good morning to you, Jerome, and thank you so much for joining us. Could you please maybe give us a synopsis on the various policies that the UK is implementing in farming and how they might be of benefit to farmers while still protecting the environment?
Yeah, well, good evening to all of you. It's a great pleasure to be part of this. Farming's got a lot of challenges at the moment. You don't need me to tell you this. They're both physical and political and also social. I'm just going to touch on those three areas and then address them from a UK perspective. I'm going to leave you to draw whatever similarities you can from your perspective. I know we have very different geographies, or we've got very different population densities, so not everything's going to translate across, but I hope that'll provide some food for thought. So first of all, with the physical, I'm a director of a farming company as well as being a politician. And here in East Anglia, I know you think it rains all the time in England, but it doesn't. And we've got water scarcity and water stress here in the driest part of England. And it's not just the scarcity of it, but the distribution of our water flow has changed really quite substantially over the last 20 years. So we're getting warmer, wetter summer patterns, and we're getting surface flooding in the winter. So we're getting more intense water distribution in the winter. The other physical thing that we're dealing with as farmers is biodiversity loss. There's a report which was commissioned by the government, the Treasury here in the UK, by Professor Dasgupta that reported earlier on this year. And he highlighted the really shocking fact that since I was born in 1970, between 1970 and 2016, 68% of the global biodiversity has been lost. That's in my lifetime, 68%. So we talk about the climate crisis, and that is very substantial. And as farmers, we see it perhaps more vividly than other people do. But there's also a crisis in biodiversity, and this is really rising up the political agenda here in the UK, and we're beginning to take the baby steps on how we can fix that, or at least arrest the decline. And that's having an impact on farmers as well. So we're going to deal with that too. So the political response to both the climate change and the biodiversity challenges, we've made it a legal requirement that the economy in the UK was going to reach carbon net zero by 2050. That was enacted back in 2018, I think. And it's going to affect agriculture, because 15% of our emissions come from agriculture. I read in advance this seminar that it's about 10% is the equivalent percentage for Australia, but it's a very substantial emitter. And Chris, in her introduction, said we need to respond to Brexit. Actually, if you forget about whether you think Brexit's a good idea or a bad idea in the global terms, but in terms of our ability to respond to climate change, it is undoubtedly a good idea when it comes to farming, because for the last 40 years, we've been part of the Common Agricultural Policy in the European Union, which has been, I suppose, if you sort of condensed it, it's just been a response to the need for food post-Second World War. And the whole emphasis has been on maximizing yield at the expense of all else. And there is a direct correlation in my mind between the impact of the Common Agricultural Policy and the reduction in biodiversity in our farming here in the UK, as well as our reduction, I think, frankly, in profitability, because we've gone for a very high impact, high inputs, expensive inputs, trying to chase yield. And the people who've done really well out of that have been the chemicals companies and the machinery businesses. But as farmers, we've become dependent on direct subsidy from the government, and our profitability has been really impacted, despite billions of pounds of subsidy going in from central government. So the Common Agricultural Policy, I think, was both an economic and an environmental mistake. And Brexit has allowed us to decouple from that. And you're beginning to see the policy fruits coming through in two landmark bits of legislation. So you've got the Agriculture Act and the Environment Bill, which is coming through the last stages of the UK Parliament and should be enacted towards the end of this year. So what does that mean? The Agriculture Bill allows us to move away from the Common Agricultural Policy, which is direct payments to farmers based on land area, towards ELM. So that's Environmental Land Management Scheme. So the catchphrase is, we're going to give you public money for public goods. And those public goods are going to be about management of biodiversity. They're going to be about public access. There's going to be about carbon management and restoration of carbon heavy areas such as peat bogs. And it provides the potential for substantial incentivization for farmers to do what they want to do anyway, which is to be good custodians of the land that they've either bought or inherited. Then the second area is the Environment Bill, which does a lot of other things, but one of the key issues that's going to affect farmers, in my view, is it's putting in a legal requirement that for any development, so this is housing or business development, building, there is a requirement that the program ends up providing a 10% biodiversity net gain. So developers are going to have to start thinking about how can they actually improve the net biodiversity as a result of their developments. Now, they'll try and squeeze trees on the streets and all the rest of it, but that's tickling around the edges. What it's highly likely to do is to develop a market for landowners to be able to sell biodiversity net gain. And that's what I'm interested in, and I think we should all be interested in as conservatives, is how can we create markets that we get governments out of the way, we hold the rules, and we set the rules of the game, but we let markets provide solutions. So the other thing we got is carbon reduction. As farmers, we've got what people need, and that is the ability to store carbon. Now, you're ahead of us, I think, in Australia, and that you've got decent trading on carbon credits, as I understand it, for farmers. That doesn't yet exist in the UK. The reason why is because we're not yet sure that we can demonstrate the genuine carbon sequestration and that it's permanent. So in order to create an effective market in this area, you're going to have to prove that you're sequestering carbon in the topsoil and that it's there permanently. Now, there is some interesting technology that I'm aware of that claims that it can measure this accurately, but it's still in its infancy. But that is a really serious secondary market for farmers, potentially, where if we can, we talk about in policy terms about regeneration and edge of field, I'm going to call it, edge of field biodiversity improvement, and also sequestration in restoration of carbon heavy areas. But the real prize, in my view, is if we can identify carbon sequestration practices in field, because that's by vastly the biggest surface area of our country. And if you can increase the permanent carbon content of your topsoil by just 1%, then that equates to 9 tons of carbon per hectare. So these are potentially really massive inputs. And we talk a lot about regenerative agriculture these days. We talk about how we need to improve the carbon content of topsoil in order to maximize its water retention, particularly as a response to uneven water flows and the feast and famine of water. And this is a mutually enforcing virtuous circle in my mind, that as we move to the increased cost of carbon inputs, say chemical fertilizers, we need to transfer fertility arguments away from chemical inputs into increased soil structure, fertility through soil. That means increased carbon content, which improves our water retention, which is another benefit. And it also provides the potential for a very strong secondary market if you have a price for carbon. And so that's the key thing behind all of this as Conservatives, is we need to generate markets. And the thing that generates the market is true exchange, where we have a price for carbon that is part of the economic exchange. I've spoken for long enough. It's a very large topic. But the one last thing, social. We've just published a national food strategy. It calls for a 30% reduction in the consumption of meat over the next 20 or so years. There are societal changes going on, and as farmers, we need to think about what our response to that is. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks so much for that summary, Jerome. No doubt we'll go back to those areas that you've covered. And I will now introduce Darren. Good evening, Darren. Very warm welcome to you. As a member of the National Party, which represents regional Australia, could you tell us a little bit about the Australian farmers' challenges and opportunities? What are the initiatives that are being implemented at the moment, or what would you like to see being implemented to support farmers who are doing the right thing for the environment?
Well, thanks, Christina, and thanks, Jerome. Rather than repeat anything you've said, Jerome, I associate myself with your remarks. There's a lot in there that are similar challenges we face here in Australia, perhaps on a larger scale, given the landscape we're dealing with. I want to stress from the outset that I'm not a farmer. My parents came off farms, and I grew up with exposure to the lifestyle, but none of the seasonal perils that the families in my community exposed to as farmers themselves. And I guess unlike a lot of Australians today, and Larry would know this well, coming from where he does in northern New South Wales, I actually know some farmers. We're actually a very urbanised country in Australia, and a lot of Australians don't know any farmers themselves. I represent one of the most productive agricultural regions in Australia. 20% of Australia's dairy production comes from Gippsland. We've got horticulture, beef, lamb, wild catch fishery, forestry, both plantation and native harvest. So we're exposed to all the conversations around the primary production sector. I do have a concern that Australians are incredibly disconnected from the sources of production in our land, and they have very little practical understanding of the challenges or the opportunities that exist in the agriculture sector here in Australia. There's a stereotypical view of the farming sector in Australia, which is reinforced in a lot of the mainstream media, and that's of a sort of grass-chewing, gumboot-wearing, somewhat uneducated bloke. You only hear about farmers when they're whinging about a drought or a fire or a flood, where you might see them on Farmer Wants a Wife. So it's a somewhat negative portrayal of rural and regional life, that the farmer's there to exploit the land and they don't have any care for the environment, which, as everyone on this conversation tonight is well aware of, is simply not true. And that the farming community that I deal with is very interested in sustainability. But I think we have a huge challenge as a nation to educate our community about what the challenges are, what the opportunities are, and what's actually occurring on the ground today. Proudly, Jerome, and I use this by way of background, our government, our farming sector has an ambition to increase farm gate output by 2030 to $100 billion. And that 2030 ambition recognises what an important social and economic driver the agriculture sector is to the wealth of our nation. It's obviously a very export-focused industry here in Australia, but we do have a lot of pride in those clean and green products that we provide to the world. But we also recognise that such an ambitious plan for the future will need to make sure the farmers themselves can be strong and profitable and have that sustainable future. So it's got to be done in a very balanced way. We need to really keep telling the story and tell it better. And I encourage and congratulate the NFF on its leadership in recent times in being prepared to put forward some bold plans, develop partnerships, tell the story in the media and collaborate in the interests of all Australians. It's not just about the farming sector, it's about recognising the need for collaboration across the mainstream community. I don't need to tell anyone on our hookup tonight that agriculture is changing, and the rate of change under all the forecasts will accelerate. It's, I guess, a statement of the obvious. Along with those challenges, though, there are opportunities, and we have been great innovators, great investors in research and technology. I'm not sure that we've always been great at sharing the knowledge as quickly as we possibly can to bring others along on the journey in terms of explaining what the advantages will be for individual landholders in each breakthrough in research, whether we share it quickly enough. How we respond to these challenges is going to really, I think, define the future for the families on the land for the next generation. We need to recognise the average farmer in Australia is 56, which is 17 years older than the average worker in the community. So we do have an ageing workforce. And before the conversation started tonight, Oscar and I were talking about the need to attract workers, skilled workers to his region to take advantage of the conditions that are occurring this year with a good yield on the way. I think there's an opportunity here that we're seeing with the impact of the pandemic, that there's more interest amongst urban Australians to consider life in regional Australia, whether that little sugar hit we've seen in terms of people moving from the city to countries, whether it becomes a sustained demographic change, it's hard to know at the moment, but there's certainly an opportunity for us to talk positively about rural and regional life and explain to young people in particular the incredible opportunities that are there. It's not all about sweltering in the fields with a shovel digging out thistles every day. There are some pretty high-tech kit and some highly skilled jobs and people with technical capacity are required to make us achieve what we're seeking to achieve as a nation in terms of agriculture. I push back a lot on the commentary in my own party, and I don't want to be too political tonight. I do push back on some of the commentary from some in my party that farmers aren't interested in environmental sustainability. Some of the comments that some of my colleagues make disappoint me, because I find the farming sector in my region are some of the most practical environmentalists of the nation. It's not unusual at all to find the people who are the president or the secretary of a VFF, Victorian Farmers Federation branch, are also the president of the local land care branch as well. They're doing the riverbank vegetation work, they're doing the shelter belts, they value biodiversity, they understand the impact of pest plants and animals and control that's needed there. They understand climate variability and the challenge it presents, and they're proud of what they do and they want to be there in the long run. So I push back on that narrative from some in my party, much to my own, how would we describe it, much to my own political ramifications. But I do find that, in the ag sector in my community, there's a lot of confidence, a lot of positivity around things. Practical examples I've seen in my community around, I live in the catchment of the Gippsland Lakes, and where we've worked with the dairy farmers on incentivising through government funding whole farm management plans. So going to the farming community and saying, well, we'll help you do a whole farm management plan to reduce your nutrient runoff, because we know the nutrients that are coming off your farm have an impact on algal blooms, which have an impact on the livability of the region, the rivers, on the lakes. And just by doing that work, we've been able to dramatically reduce the amount of nutrients entering the Gippsland Lakes. The farmers benefit, they get to reuse their wastewater, they're getting better productivity as a direct result, and the community benefits. The community sees that the farming sector is partnering with them on this livability issue and this tourism sector issue. So there are practical examples where our farmers on a landscape scale are doing the right thing for biodiversity and for reducing waste and reinvesting their own properties. I've seen the same with water. You talked about water before, Jerome. We obviously have a drier climate, but we're seeing massive investment in piping of channels, old irrigation systems where we have huge issues with evaporation and leaking channels. Just piping those channels is providing increased efficiency, and that partnership between the farmers and the state and federal governments is allowing our farmers then to enter into supply contracts with more confidence because they know the water is going to be there. The water that they've purchased is going to be there when they need it to finish off their crops. So there are a lot of practical local examples I'm seeing where we're not necessarily going to work any harder to achieve our $100 billion output by 2030. We're just going to work smarter. And again, the plant science industry is another good example where we recognise that resources are finite, but they're working to produce more with less and improving the sustainability while increasing productivity. So it is a big topic. It's one that I think Australians need to get a better understanding of where their food comes from and how our agricultural sectors investing very heavily in their own future sustainability. Things like our national soil strategy, things like the NFF 2030 plan, things like how we partner with the ag sector to improve soil carbon. They're all initiatives that I think Australians would be better informed to make decisions and have a greater appreciation of our ag sector if they knew a little bit more about what we're doing. So it's not, I guess it's no surprise that someone who comes from a media background thinks we need to sell the message better, but we should be proud of what we've done. We've got a rich heritage in our agricultural sector, but we do have challenges and we need to keep selling the messages better about what we're able to do and how we keep feeding Australians and millions of others around the world. So thank you, Christina, for the opportunity, and I appreciate the format tonight.
Thank you so much, Darren, for your insights. We'll move straight to the panel now, and I want to bring Doug and Oscar in. Doug, welcome. Thanks for being here as well. It's as we mentioned, agriculture contributes to just over 10% here in Australia of emissions, and the biggest polluters from agriculture are methane from livestock and then nitrous oxide from soil. Can you please tell us, in your capacity with the meat industry, what is it doing to reduce emissions, and why has MLA set such an ambitious target, a 2030 net zero target?
Happy to respond to that question, Christina. Thank you for involving me in tonight's discussion, and thank you for both ministers to provide that useful introduction to set the scene. Just a little bit about Meat and Livestock Australia. We're a not-for-profit research and development corporation, so we're not a political advocacy body, and we're not an industry representative body either. We're the service provider that collects industry and government funds and invests those in technology development, marketing and communications activities to support the industry. So with that in mind, although often MLA is held up as having set the carbon neutral 2030 target for the sector, it's actually the industry that's ratified the target. MLA's role is to invest in supporting the industry to achieve the aspiration. And just so we're clear on what the target means, it means net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2030, which is a function of emissions minus carbon storage equaling net zero carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And I think that's important because those who are listening, who have an understanding of the science, might have questions around how things are measured and reported and how metrics are considered as part of that equation. So as we spent probably the last 5 years really diving into the net zero target, initially prospecting it using some of the best science organisations in Australia, and CSIRO led the charge, and that led them to answering the question whether the Australian red meat industry could achieve a net zero position by 2030, to which the answer obviously was yes. They presented a number of scientific pathways, and when you whittle it all down, the mission critical jobs for the Australian red meat industry to achieve the net zero target is honing in on reducing enteric methane emissions as a byproduct of digestion in livestock. And the good news is that some of the technologies there deliver really nice multiple benefits in the form of livestock productivity, alongside reductions in methane emissions from the digestive process, and we can come back to that in the Q&A. That's one mission critical area, particularly in the breeding herd, which are in the central and northern southern parts of Australia. The other key issue for the industry to overcome is accelerating carbon capture and storage. And a lot of the emphasis, and farmers really love the notion of putting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into soils because, again, the clear multiple benefits that are available. The challenge in Australia is working with the environment in which we all live and operate as farmers. And I think Minister Mayhew was talking about carbon capture rates that are potential in the UK, but comparatively speaking, still better clay content, better soil types in the UK, and significantly more rainfall than most parts in Australia. And so one of the environmental limitations to carbon capture and storage in soils in Australia is our soil type, which is typically the poorest of any serious agricultural producing country in the world, and our rainfall, which is also largely significantly deficient against some of the international agricultural countries. So the potential for soil carbon is highly aspirational. Producers love it. However, our ability to capture and store it in soils in Australia is limited to some other countries, but we're very focused on it, making best use of available rain. And not surprisingly, a lot of those efforts are honing on the coastal areas in Australia with rainfall above 600 to 700 millimetres per year. And so we're seeing heat maps of focus areas for soil carbon projects. Let's also not forget that there's above ground carbon stores, that is woody biomass, most commonly trees. It's a bit of a contentious issue in Australia where much of Australia in the northern parts is unexplored and underdeveloped. And so on one hand, the grazing industries see a carbon store. On the other hand, primary producers also want to make a living off that land. And so the complication is being able to navigate organising vegetation management activities in a way that we can still capture and store carbon in woody vegetation, but utilise it for agricultural production reasons. And so a lot of the unexplored areas, particularly in Northern Australia, are working through that landscape management thinking at the moment. And so therein lies probably the key opportunity areas for Australia, honing in on enteric methane emissions management with a dual-pronged approach in mind. And there are some promising technologies that are being commercialised as we speak to address that. Promoting soil carbon sequestration in storage, using deep-rooted perennial pastures and legumes that push organic matter deep into soils below the oxidation level, typically below 10 centimetres in the soil into a stable fraction. And then working with what woody vegetation we have, predominantly in Northern Australia, to organise that in a way that we can continue to capture the carbon store, but enable agricultural productivity at the same time. And our insights are that the modelling that has occurred through the CSIRO has demonstrated that it is possible for the sector to hold productivity where it is at the moment and even potentially increase it. That is 26 million cattle in Australia, 70 million sheep in Australia, and achieve a net zero position by 2030 with those emerging technologies and practices. So I might just pause there for a moment, Christina, and maybe give Oscar the opportunity to talk, but looking forward to the discussion, and I can see there's a bunch of questions popping up already.
Yeah, there's lots of questions here, Doug, and I'll get back to you. I wanted to ask you about seaweed, but I'll do that later. I wanted to introduce Oscar now, who's a farmer. Oscar, welcome. Would you like to share your experience as a farmer, but also maybe discuss a little bit about land reform, how it protects natural habitats and farmers at the same time?
Thanks, Christina, and thanks for the opportunity. I'm here at Moree, which is currently having one of its best years in recorded history, but only a couple of years ago, it would have been a completely different story. We were in the middle of an unforeseeable, almost unmitigatable level of drought, and the increasing problems for production in Australian agriculture, as we see an increasingly variable climate as a result of human activities, is a major challenge for everyone throughout the agricultural supply chain, but particularly for farmers. Our business is sixth generation. We've got a lot of mistakes to learn from in terms of land management, in terms of clearing and development activities, opportunities foregone, and now we're looking at the current set of circumstances and the current markets, and trying to see what we can do to be profitable and to increase our productivity, but also to deal in these new markets that are emerging. Jerome, I think, said it beautifully. Farmers are conservatives because we fundamentally believe in the value of markets to solve problems. That's what we're here for. Give us a market signal and we can achieve, whether we're using new science, whether we're using new technologies, new measurement tools, adding new infrastructure, capital items. We can solve just about any challenge in Australian agriculture so long as we have a clear set of market directions. And that's been lacking. Over the last 30 years, Australian farmers have seen increasing amounts of regulation, particularly on biodiversity and conservation. And unfortunately, that's put a lot of farmers in, as Darren mentioned, a strange place where we're creating huge amounts of positive externalities for the rest of the Australian community in the world. We're managing biodiversity, we're improving the soil through particularly enhancement of soil carbon. We're sequestering carbon in the vegetation that Doug mentioned. But up to this point, most of us have not received anything tangible in return. We haven't had a market signal. And in fact, from an investor point of view, banks and corporate investors have often seen areas of high biodiversity value or areas linked to carbon sequestration projects as having a negative value. So we're actually seeing markets and the commercial investors not believing the hype and in fact putting negative values on those areas that are set aside or dedicated to biodiversity and conservation. I think it's a wonderful time though, because Darren's colleague, Minister Littleproud, has really focused on that. Let's get some market forces and get the value of the market giving the signals to farmers. So we're seeing the development of biodiversity markets, the enhancement of the existing emissions reduction fund to allow more methodologies. Doug talked about some of those, better science, better measurement techniques, cheaper ways of engaging, and the ability for farmers to suddenly see biodiversity and ecosystem services as not an unpaid impediment to our productivity, but in fact a bolster. And as we work, Australian agriculture is export reliant. Different industries at different levels, but generally it's about 3/4 to 80% of Australian agricultural production is exported. As a food producer, meeting these emergent ESG-based global market trends, we need to be on par. I can see in Australia, where for decades we've focused on the integrity of our products in terms of food safety and chemical residue tracing. Now is the time, and Minister Littleproud's doing great work on this, to turn our market's attention towards what are the biodiversity attributes that our food can carry to get us the best prices on international markets. The only way we meet the $100 billion target that the NFF has set is through enhancing the value. So better carbon attributes, better biodiversity attributes. Part of that target that's not often talked about is the fact that NFF has set 5% of that 5% of that $100 billion target is actually towards ecosystem services. Getting farmers paid, setting up efficient market systems where we can see biodiversity as a valuable thing, a way that we can monetize it, enhance resiliency during droughts, maintain currency of employment, keep people in regional communities busy when otherwise during drought we'd be reducing staff numbers. There are a lot of opportunities. It is very exciting, but the markets have got to be designed right. Farmers have got to be very well consulted. And there are some historical, I guess you'd have to call them historical inequities that also need to be solved. Farmers have done a huge amount in the past, which hasn't been rewarded. On our farm, we've been using zero-till cropping for nearly 20 years now. We've built our soil carbon up over that period, and we've actually now hit a plateau. So for us, from a biophysical sense, unless there's a new technology that can increase the amount of soil in our carbon, we're going to find it very difficult to enter into that soil carbon market because of the transience of this very small amount that we're already able to add. There are other areas where there is more potential, but in a lot of ways, farmers are sort of looking back going, well, why wasn't I paid for that thing? Or why haven't I been given a reward for a positive externality that I've been delivering? There's a lot of questions about how that policy can be shaped correctly going forward to recognise what we've done in the past and what we're doing and able to do in the future. I think I'll leave it there for a panel discussion.
Thank you, Oscar. We discussed the biodiversity credits and carbon credits being a secondary, generating income for farmers and becoming a secondary market for farmers. And I think Jerome brought up the fact that how do we actually manage to, in terms of the quality of the measurement, to bring it to an auditable level, to be able to really price the value of what these farmers are doing in terms of creating the market. And I also brought up the role, I know it's a free market thing, but if what we're doing is really merely providing a price for carbon, but not a market or a demand, because the big polluters are not really forced to pay for it, then how does it happen? So I just wanted to refer to Darren and Jerome on that. As government, what can they do?
I'll go first if you'd like me to. There is, just dealing with what Darren was talking about, there is a huge amount of money, corporate, institutional money, that is desperate to invest in this sector. I had a meeting earlier on this week with the Environment Bank, where that one organisation has raised a fund of £200 million, which they want to invest in biodiversity because they see a long-term return. It's predictable. If you've got a clear market signal, then there's institutional money that can come in and develop this market very quickly. Funnily enough, in the UK, one of the challenges to that is there's non-governmental organisations who want to, in a sense, capture that market for the not-for-profit sector or governmental sectors and freeze the market out. So my response to that as a conservative is we've got to allow the space for the free market to get in there and provide, they've got the cash, they're very keen to invest, they're very keen on the predictable long-term returns, particularly in the current economic environment. And it's the role of government, as Doug said, is to set out clear market signals, because they're incredibly effective, particularly at a time when governments don't have a lot of cash. So we've just spent 400 billion and counting on our response to COVID. I do not want to be the person knocking on the door of the Treasury saying, I've got this really expensive command and control plan for increasing biodiversity subsidies. What's much more effective is saying, look, a clear market signal and let the free market come and solve our problems. But what you need, and Chris, you sort of hinted at this, is you need a price for carbon or a price for biodiversity, whichever one you want to look at, in order to unleash the power of the free market. And what we haven't discussed is carbon pricing. I know that's a big topic, but without an effective and efficient price for carbon, we're left with governments shooting at individual problems rather than having a market that can solve a myriad of problems all at once.
Thanks, Jerome, and thanks, Oscar. And when the time comes, we'd be happy for you to nominate for the seat of Parks to run for the Nationals. So if you want to ruin your life. Look, just on your points around rewarding best practice and past practice, I think it's a really valid point you make, and it's something I think as part of this, as this conversation matures, recognising the good work that's already been done is going to be critical. The rehabilitation that's already occurred. One point I would make around the investor capacity or the investor interest is the issue of brand provenance, that people are becoming more and more interested in where their food and fibre is coming from. And if they're that interested and that focused on environmental issues, they're going to be prepared to perhaps pay a bit more for it as well. So there's some elements of this which are a broader conversation with our metropolitan cousins about, well, you're putting standards, you're putting these requirements on, and we're agreeing with you on the need for this, these sequestration of carbon, biodiversity, and rehabilitation of the landmass. But there's a price that comes with that, and you're going to have to be part of that conversation too. So I think there is a conversation we can have that it's not a negative conversation. It's one that people want to feel like they're doing the right thing and they want to make a contribution. Relieving them some of that money to redistribute it to some of our regional communities, I don't think is a bad outcome. But I do agree, again, Jerome, the market mechanism and some policy certainty. The lack of certainty has been half the problem. I mean, you look at, I've been in Parliament over 13 years, has been this issue of emissions, climate change, policy setting in Australia has been the killing field for leaders from, you know, Rudd, Turnbull, Gillard, Abbott, Turnbull again. It's been a very difficult area for leaders on both sides of politics to resolve. And my sense is there's a middle ground there amongst the vast majority of members in the place that if you can provide some policy certainty and get it off the day-to-day news cycle, people like yourself, Oscar, are in a much stronger position to make decisions about how you manage your land mass.
Thank you very much for that comment. And there are so many questions. I wanted to get into livestock and a little bit of climate mitigation and even finance, but I think we'll go and start looking at the questions that are here. Starting from one I've received from Brendan Williams, he's asking, are conservative policies helping farmers or hurting farmers? And how can we get conservatives to change and be more progressive? Maybe it's a question for you, Darren.
Good question. The problem we have in Australia, we've got a participatory representative democracy system. Participatory means people need to participate at grassroots level. That's not happening. So you get a very small number of people join political parties now, and they can capture the views, I believe, of the sitting member or the candidates, with a very small number of people. You know, if I espoused some of the comments of my Senate colleagues who have to get pre-selected by a small number of people in a Senate pre-selection environment, in my electorate more broadly, I would be laughed at, because the broader community's got a more moderating influence on policy. So the challenge for us all is to make sure that we participate in the debate at a local level and influence the views of our elected members. Now, you know, my community is changing all the time. Gippsland, as I said at the outset, it's a very strong agricultural producing region, but I've actually got more nurses in Gippsland than I have farmers. So I need to understand that health services are a critical part of my role as a local member, represent their views as well. So, I mean, I don't know if I actually answered the question, but it's encouraging your local members to really engage more broadly, not just with the people who join your political party. Because if you only engage with people who join your political party, you're only going to hear one side of the debate.
I think somebody made a comment that might help actually for the Nationals who are supporting the farmers. Here she says, Julia is saying, congrats to the UK for focusing on net gain as opposed to net loss, which has historically been the story in Australia. We focus too much on what we're going to lose if we're looking after climate and embracing environment rather than what we've got to win with that. So maybe that's the message that we should start changing. And I think it started changing already. But let's move on to you, Jerome. There's a question from Ivan here. What is the government doing to promote the development of biogas from feedlots, dairies and agricultural waste? The addition of 2% seaweed to animal feed reduces methane emissions by over 90%. Is there anything being done in the UK or Australia even to, you know, to do with seaweed?
Okay, so I don't claim expertise on this. We have this weird system in the UK in that we've specialised our farming. So the right-hand side of the country, the east, is overwhelmingly arable, and the vast majority of the animals are on the left-hand side on the west. What I do have, I'm very aware of the if you add seaweed to foodstuffs, you can reduce methane in livestock. And just off my coast, I'm 3 miles from the coast here. And we've got a nascent seaweed production facility that is just about to employ about 250 people just off my coast here. So it's a developing area. You know, we're very interested in it. There are some startup businesses, but it's not established. And I suspect we've got there's plenty to learn from you guys on that. But it's an exciting area. If we're going to maintain meat production, which we all want to, then this is one of the things we've got to address.
And look, I mean, the New South Wales government has made some significant planning priorities for biomethane within the agricultural industry as part of their net zero plans. I should point out, with the lack of clear planning from the Commonwealth, all of the Australian states have developed various carbon neutral plans and strategies. Some are more progressed than others, but the New South Wales one has drilled down after consulting with New South Wales farmers and other industry groups, and has a clear focus. As of 2022, you'll be able to buy a Case New Holland methane powered tractor. Methane concentrators and biogas facilities are available. It's European technology that is being imported here, and the viability of scale of those have been assessed, and farmers are looking at these sort of options. And I guess that's a key thing, even without clear government directions on, for instance, emissions price or a carbon tax or a cap and trade system. Even then, the efficiency dividends that can be gained in agriculture through essentially reducing waste or collecting these byproducts can be a commercially viable opportunity even without that. It just would be a lot easier with a little bit more government leadership in that area and with clear targets. Australia is certainly one where the business community, where investors and small investors like our family farm, just as much as large multinationals, are doing the due diligence about the impact of climate change, but also then really closely looking at the efficiencies that we can gain through adopting these new technologies, like a methane powered tractor. The numbers are pretty good. If you've got a feedlot over about 7,000 head, then running the feeding tractors that operate daily to feed those cattle, you can essentially get rid of your diesel fuel bills. So the net saving and the capital investment makes sense, even at that small scale. And that's happening across a range of industries, red meat, but also the intensive animal industries as well.
So I should have mentioned too about your comments regarding Mr. Littleproud and the importance of the leadership. I think his willingness to get out there in front of a few of the people who are, let's say, are, how would you describe them?
Luddites.
Okay, it's more polite if you do it, has been valued, and seeing the NFF and others coming in very strongly as well, that leadership and then backing in when you've got someone who's being a champion for the industry is important. I know I found that when I had the Veterans Affairs portfolio, it's all very well for you as a minister to go out there and get a few kicks in the head, but if the representative group or the peak bodies come out and say, hang on, this guy's on the right track here, it certainly quietens down the debate a bit. And I think he's been, willing to put his head out there a bit and had copped a few whacks, but the NFF and other organisations have certainly backed him in that regard.
Christina, I'd be happy to talk a little bit to some of Ivan's points if you'd like, but I'm conscious that I think there's 25 questions in there. So would you like to spend a bit more time on this one or keep moving through the list?
I would like to move on to the free trade agreement questions that are there, and you might be able to talk about it, Doug, because it has a lot to do with how it will affect the viability of Australia's beef exports. If you want to comment, do you know anything on how it's going to affect our beef exports when we sign the FTA with the UK? There are some comments that our beef industry will be able to double or triple or quadruple the amount of exports, and will it, I suppose, how will it benefit then, Jerome? What will happen to your farmers, your beef farmers?
Would you like to me to lead with that then? Yeah, sure. So look, at this point in time, Australia's been very lucky to put in place an excellent trade arrangement with the UK that includes beef. At this point in time, there's no restrictions around emissions component of that trade. However, we understand that Europe are looking at various measures to factor those aspects into commodity import. At this point, it's not on the table. But suffice to say that our efforts to achieve a net zero position by 2030 are there for multiple reasons, and one of those is ensuring ongoing access to consumers who are looking for products that meet those needs. And it's a key part of the motivation for the industry's action. The good news is that the sector's reduced net emissions by 50% relative to 2005. The emissions intensity of the product is globally incredibly competitive. because of the incredibly efficient system that we operate in Australia. So we don't see it as a risk at this point that would interact or it would reduce trade into the UK. However, we're certainly not resting on our laurels and pushing hard to ensure that if that becomes a requirement, we're really well positioned.
Thank you, Doug. Any comments, Jerome? I know you mentioned that the FTA would act for the UK as a gateway or a precursor to the UK membership to the CPTPP.
Yeah, so I'm all in favour of free trade. So trade benefits us all, and particularly with our friends. And Australia is one of our closest friends. I know you're a long way away, but we share so much. And certainly personally speaking, I want to develop and deepen our connections and our trade. And it makes us all richer. Free trade makes us all richer. And yeah, there may be some local political hurdles that we all as politicians have to overcome to facilitate it, but the prize is very significant. As for the impact of the potential impact of Australian beef in the UK, I used to be a businessman. Businesses hate competition because it reduces our profitability, at least we think it does. But actually, it keeps us on our toes, it makes us more productive, and we all benefit. And I think it's going to be the same here. We've got a transition phase of at least 10 years to allow businesses to adapt. And I think there's going to be a move to quality in terms of red meat. I mentioned the National Food Strategy, which suggests a reduction in overall meat consumption by 30%. I have to make clear that's not government policy yet. The government has committed to producing a white paper in response within the next 6 months. But it feels like it's the social direction of travel, that people are going to move away from the current volumes of meat, but they're going to move towards quality. And I think the UK can compete very well in terms of quality, and so I think we can fight our own corner. Where I think Doug made an interesting point is the assessment of carbon coming into economies. I think this is something which is going to develop quite quickly. On the 15th of July, the European Union published a draft bill for a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a border assessment of carbon inputs. It's the precursor to allow you to raise the price of carbon in domestic industries without being undercut by carbon competition. So this is something which is very live. My own personal view is it's something that the UK should be looking at very carefully, rather than being on the outside, having it imposed on us. I think it's something we need to be looking at pretty seriously ourselves.
Thanks, Jerome. I think we've only got time now for one or two more, but there's one here for Darren. Darren, Max Bale is asking you, saying in Australia, the government has control over a considerable amount of Crown land. What policy options are there to put the Crown land to work to address climate change? What are the incentives that can be implemented to use Crown land in a way that will address climate change and still improve soils?
Thanks, Christina. And Jerome, I did notice that Ian Botham is now the UK trade envoy to Australia. So
problems are solved.
I'm not sure who we send in return, Dennis Lilly or someone. Good question, Max. The point about the Crown Land Estate in Australia, obviously, is it's primarily owned and managed by state governments. I've had a lot to say about natural resource management more generally in my electorate. We are custodians of a vast natural estate here. I think about 75% of my electorate's Crown land. But there's very few resources allocated in terms of boots on the ground to maintain and ensure that it's presented in a way that benefits our community. So there's often a saying in my community, the worst neighbour is having a state forest or national park next to you, because you have the pest plants and animals coming off the public land estate and you've got to deal with them on your private land. And that interface has been a real problem for us, which I guess is not really answering your question in particular, Max, other than to say that the lack of boots on the ground to do the practical environmental work is a fundamental problem with how the Crown land is managed in Victoria. I can't talk for other states, but our summer bushfires in 2019-20, every one of those fires came off the public land estate. There was no arsonist involved. There was no farmer with an angle grinder or a faulty tractor. It all came off the public land estate. The lack of fuel reduction burning, the lack of mechanical clearing around towns exacerbated those fires so that they caused more damage than they needed to cause. Now, they were natural events, they were lightning strikes, but we are not managing the public land estate very well here in Victoria. And at least part of it is the lack of men and women on the ground with the technical skills or the physical skills to actually do the work. And we've got feral pigs, deer, rabbits, obviously, carp, invasive species right throughout the public land estate. It's a real problem for us in terms of biodiversity.
Thanks, Darren. Jerome, do you have a problem in the UK?
No, because we don't have public land in the same way that you do. We've been it's a small country with lots of people on it, so most of it's private land.
Got the opposite problem. Well, I think finally, one final question, and that will be perhaps for Darren or anyone who wants to comment, but how important is it for us to set a net zero by 2015, especially in terms of agriculture, Darren?
Look, I'll start. Perhaps the more important thing is bringing the Australian public with us to provide that policy certainty, so that our problem here in Australia is our federal election terms are meant to be 3 years. They often don't get past 2 years and 9 months, and then you're at the whim of a potential change in government policy. We need to build a consensus across the community as best we possibly can, and then back in that policy certainty so people make long-term investment decisions. So people who are, got significant land holdings are going to invest confidently, knowing there's a return for them. I think the comment that you made at the outset, Jerome, around public monies for public good would resonate with a lot of the agricultural sector. If you're going to lock in some change of land practice or sharing of research and knowledge so that people invest in it, they need to know there's going to be a return on their investment. So I think the net zero emissions conversation, the National Party needs to make sure it doesn't rule itself out of the conversation. We need to make sure we're part of that conversation, representing our people, so that if there are benefits to be had, our communities will achieve those benefits. You've got to bring the Australian people with you and try and get out of that daily news cycle of a he said, she said personality contest and focus on the issue rather than the personalities, which is very difficult in modern Australian political and media landscape.
Thank you so much. We're running out of time, so I'd love to now invite our C4C ambassador, Larry Anthony. He's the former president of the National Party, and he'll be doing the closing remarks. Over to you, Larry.
Look, thank you, Christina. And before I sort of talk to our speakers and thank them, to all the 96 participants too, I think it's tremendous, Christina, that the Coalition for Conservation has someone like you who's helping facilitate this debate. And I think it's really important too that we're hearing from other nations, and this court, of course, the United Kingdom, and there's so much history with Australia and the UK. And particularly as you go towards Glasgow in 2021, and the whole world will be gathering there to set, I suppose, the next plan or targets for the planet. Jerome, can I just thank you for your input? I think hearing that you are involved in farming, you've got a very much commercial background. You're a free marketeer. Sometimes you can't really say that in Australia. But I think the comments that you made, and particularly the interest in this agricultural bill and the environmental bill, and trying to manage not just the carbon issue, but biodiversity, which I think is probably more prevalent in a more highly populated country relative to Australia. And I think particularly your comments on carbon sequestration, which was also picked up by Doug, and hearing what you're doing in meat and livestock, MIA, I think MLA was excellent. It's very courageous, I think, when you're talking about a zero target by 2030 and what the beef industry is doing here in Australia. And of course, Jerome, what you're trying to do, not just with reduction in meat. I don't know whether most Australians would agree with that, but obviously in the social impact as well. I've known Darren for a very long time, and of course he's been heavily involved in Australian politics at very senior levels. And I thought, Darren, the comments that you made, which is really important for all Western jurisdictions, is that you've got to bring the public along with you. You've got to bring along your urban constituency, particularly as a public official, and try to bridge that gap between rural UK or urban UK or rural Australia, remote Australia, and tell that story. And I think, as Darren was saying, there's a lot of work that we're doing, and I know when we're talking about what you're doing, Oscar, in a very practical way up at Moree, you're literally living fire, floods, and famine, and good times, which is now. So let's celebrate and enjoy them. But as said, Darren, what you're talking about is some of the water conservation, some of the education that we're currently doing. And I think, Oscar, in a very practical way, what NFF is doing and ways to try to reduce emissions, new technology that's being used. I don't think we talk about that a lot. And just, the practical things as you've been doing as a family and being quite honest about it, that in the past practices weren't as good as they should be. But everything's a learning curve. And I think where we sort of concluded this, Christina, is with this FTA and the enormous opportunities between both countries of obviously us supplying product and the necessity to be good, clean, green product. Consumers hopefully will pay more for that, which can benefit farmers as natural custodians as they try to improve their land mass and also reduce carbon, and also better for the consumers. So I think at the end, and with all your speakers, so much of this comes down to leadership and education. And whether you're wearing a hat as a farmer or as a public official like you are, Jerome, in the UK Conservatives, Darren is, of course, in the government here now, the Nationals. Doug, what you're doing, of course, in an industry sort of representative body, and being supported by the sector, and of course in a practical sense what Oscar's doing, and all those listening on. I think it's been a very productive conversation, and I think we're all on the same page. It's just how we get there and how we take along our constituencies to ensure that we have a more sustainable agriculture. We can encourage those that have more extreme views to move towards a cleaner environment with lower emissions, and the practical ways that can be done. So thank you, Christina, and thank you to all our speakers. And I suppose it's your morning now, Jerome, so I hope you have a great day in the UK.
Thank you, Larry. And just to let everybody know, I will put on the screen now, if you have 30 seconds to spare, we have a poll, which is a little survey if you'd like to fill it in. It's only 5 questions, but I'd also like to thank everybody, and especially Larry, who just joined our team as our ambassador. We've been very appreciative of his support. Thanks again, Jerome, for joining us and for being so participant as well in our events, and Darren, Oscar, and Doug. We would love to see you again. I think there is much to talk about in the future, so hopefully we'll have a second agricultural conversation. And I just want to say that I do take my hat off to all farmers, both here in the UK and all around the world. You are definitely the backbone of our communities and society. So we're all here to help farmers too. Thank you so much, and everybody have a great evening and a great day in the UK. Bye.